Well, good morning, AP Government. Happy Monday to you. This is going to be our first asynchronous Monday, so we're just going to get used to it a little bit. I'm going to introduce this concept of federalism to you. So, on Friday in class, we finished up the Constitution. So far, we've talked about Chapter 1, which is Basics of American Government. We've talked about Chapter 2, which is the Constitution. And today we're going to get started on Chapter 3, which is federalism. I'm going to introduce some federalism concepts to you today, and then we're going to finish up federalism tomorrow. We're going to test on chapters 1, 2, and 3 on Wednesday. So that's going to involve multiple choice questions and a free response question. So today I'm going to introduce federalism to you a little bit. And don't forget, you also have a must know quiz on must know facts numbers 1 through 20 today as well. And that is in Schoology. So let's talk about federalism. Um, Federalism is the existence of multiple levels of government over the same area. So if you look at this chart, you can see obviously there is one federal government, the US government. That's also the national government, same thing. We have 50 state governments, and then we have close to 90,000 local governments in the United States. And that splits up counties, cities, towns, school districts, special districts, which is something we don't even need to get into. This leaves out territories, so there's even more than this. But federalism, when we talk about this concept, what we're really talking about is the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments. And for our purposes, mostly we'll be talking about the relationship between the national government and state governments. That's what we're going to spend a lot of our time on. So, this is what I just said, defining federalism. We're looking at multiple levels of government existing together. If you've got a job, you pay income taxes to the federal government. You also pay income taxes to the state government. And when you take that special someone out for a date, you pay the restaurant tax or sales taxes. You're paying that to the city, to the local government. All three governments have stuff to do. And in order for governments to do things, they have to collect taxes. So, um, you are right now living in the United States. You're also living in Virginia, and you're living in Virginia Beach. That's federalism at work. Now, there's disagreement among politicians, voters, political scientists about how these different levels of government should work together. In one camp, you've got people who believe in dual federalism, or what we'll call layer cake federalism. This would be the philosophy espoused by anti federalists who were very suspicious of federal government expanding power. People who believe in dual federalism believe that there should be clear boundaries between the national government and the state governments. This is sometimes called layer cake federalism because if you think of a layer cake, you've got a layer for the national government, you've got a layer for state governments, you've got a layer for local governments, and you've got that nice frosting in between to provide a barrier between the different layers. There's no overlap, there's no confusion about where one layer starts and the other layer uh, ends. So, this idea of dual federalism would protect the power of the lower levels of government. It would protect the power of states. It would protect the power of local governments from overreach and expansion by the federal government. On the other end, you've got people who believe in cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism. This is the idea that the boundaries between the different levels of government are sort of blurred, and as society changes and gets more complex and evolves, these different levels of government have to work together in new ways. Usually, what this means is that the national government has to get more powerful. It has to get a little creative. It has to do things that it hasn't done before. Cooperative federalism, or what we'll call marble cake federalism, means that the federal government is getting stronger, it's exercising power. It's kind of getting in to state government domains and saying, hey, states, we still want you to be in charge of this stuff, but we're going to tell you a little bit how you can and can't do it. And we'll get into some examples of how that has happened. But the main trend of US history has been one of marble cake federalism. It has been one of the federal government expanding. So, just a quick review of some stuff that we talked about on Friday. We're going to use these terms in this chapter when we talk about the different levels of government: expressed, enumerated, and explicit powers, implied, inherent, and inferred powers. These are federal government powers. So, expressed, enumerated, or explicit powers are federal government powers that are specifically written in the Constitution. These are things Congress can do because we can point in the Constitution to where they're written down. Implied, inherent, and inferred powers are not necessarily written in the Constitution, but the necessary and proper clause, also called the elastic clause, says that Congress has the power to do these things. So both of those are two different types of federal government powers. Again, expressed, enumerated, explicit are written in the Constitution. Implied, inherent, inferred are not written in the Constitution. They are a little more controversial. Sometimes the federal government will say they have an implied power to do things. States kind of push back. The courts have to get involved. But the expressed powers are much more clear cut. State powers are found in the 10th Amendment, the Reserved Powers Clause. The 10th Amendment says any power not given to the national government is reserved for the states. We talked about some examples of those on Friday, and we're going to talk about some more of them um, as we go through this chapter. So, like I said before, the main theme of US history has been the expansion of federal government power over time. So let's get into some examples. Let's go way back to the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson is president. He very much believes that the federal government should only be allowed to use its expressed powers. It should only be able to do things written in the Constitution. Then France comes along with the Louisiana Territory and says, hey, we'll give you this for rock bottom prices. And Thomas Jefferson has many sleepless nights. He tosses and he turns because there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can buy Louisiana from France, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says he can't. And so Jefferson goes along and buys Louisiana, and you get this example of expanding federal power over time. If even Jefferson is willing to step outside the boundaries of what's written in the Constitution, that kicks off this whole trend. We've talked about a few of these Supreme Court cases before, and a few of them have been in your must-knows, but I'm just going to highlight some important ones. All of these are early Supreme Court cases while John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the United States. So first, Marbury versus Madison gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. The Supreme Court did not originally have the power to declare federal laws unconstitutional and thereby nullify them. That's not in the Constitution. John Marshall wrote in his Marbury versus Madison opinion that the Supreme Court has this power, and everyone's sort of like, yeah, okay, I guess that makes sense. So this represents a huge expansion of power for the federal Supreme Court. In McCulloch versus Maryland, the Supreme Court emphasized the supremacy of the federal government over the states. If there is a conflict between the national government and the state governments, the federal government always wins. That's McCulloch versus Maryland. That case turned on two important clauses in the Constitution. The first one being the supremacy clause, the federal government is supreme over the states. The second one being the necessary and proper or elastic clause. Remember, that's the one that talked about implied powers. In McCulloch versus Maryland, Maryland said the whole case is about whether or not the government can create a national bank in Maryland. Maryland said it's not necessary. You can't say this falls under the necessary and proper clause because it's not necessary to build a bank. But the Supreme Court said, necessary doesn't really mean necessary. It just means it would be cool if they could do it. So they took this broad view of federal power and said the federal government can have an expanded amount of power under the necessary and proper clause. Another Supreme Court case, Gibbons versus Ogden, did kind of the same thing with the Commerce Clause, which says Congress has the power to control interstate commerce. In Gibbons versus Ogden, the Supreme Court took a broad view of um, that clause, of that power. They gave the federal government a lot of authority under Gibbons versus Ogden, and Congress used that power, that kind of vague power that they had been given under Gibbons versus Ogden, to control a lot of the economy for years to come. The last John Marshall decision that we'll talk about here is Barron versus Baltimore. This is the only one that we'll focus on that protected the power of the states. In Barron versus Baltimore, the Supreme Court said that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. It's kind of weird because it does now, but that took a process. Originally, the Supreme Court said the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. John Marshall said the Bill of Rights was designed to protect people from the federal government, not from the states. So there's no way states can become tyrannical. Of course, we would find out later. Of course, states can be tyrannical, but that's going to take time. So originally, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. That changes after the 14th Amendment is ratified. It takes time during the 20th century for the Supreme Court to start applying the Bill of Rights to the states, to start saying it is now the federal government's responsibility to make sure that states are protecting people's civil rights and civil liberties as well. That process is called selective incorporation. So where before, in Barron versus Baltimore, the Supreme Court had said, states, you don't have to follow the Bill of Rights. In the 20th century, the 1900s, the Supreme Court starts applying the Bill of Rights to the states in a process called selective incorporation, and they use the 14th Amendment to justify it. So that's why today states do have to follow the Bill of Rights. It just took some time and took this selective incorporation process based on the 14th Amendment for that to happen. In the 1930s, under Franklin Roosevelt, we get the New Deal. This is where, for really the first time, people look to the federal government to solve economic problems. You may remember under President Obama that people looked to the federal government for solutions in the economic crisis. That traces its roots back to the Great Depression, which was so bad that for really the first time, ordinary people looked to the federal government to solve the problem. Then in the 1960s, you get President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which Johnson viewed as building on the New Deal. He saw it as finishing FDR's work. So Johnson created programs like Medicare, which is federal government provided health care for the elderly, and Medicaid, which is federal government provided health care for people with disabilities and people with low incomes. These programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and the New Deal program, Social Security, become huge parts of the federal government budget. They make the federal government much bigger. They get it more involved in people's daily lives. And especially throughout the 20th century, we have people really looking to the federal government as society is getting more complex. People look to the federal government for solutions to their problems more so than state and local governments. All right, and the last thing for today, government incentives to states to get them to do things. So sometimes the government will give states a chunk of money to accomplish a task. If the federal government says, hey, here's a big block of money, you can use it on this vague idea. Use it to fix your education system. Use it to do some criminal justice reform. But if they don't give states lots of requirements, if they don't attach lots of strings to the money, that's called a block grant. A block grant is very vague. It's sort of like, here, states, we want you to solve this problem. We don't care how you do it. Here's the money to do it. States really like block grants. States don't so much like categorical grants. Categorical grants are when the money comes with many strings attached. When the federal government says, this is the program we're implementing, we know exactly how much it should cost you. Therefore, that's the exact amount of money we're going to give you and not a penny more. We want you to account for every dollar that we give you. States prefer block grants because it gives them more freedom. They don't so much like categorical grants, but either way, states are happy to get money. They would just prefer it to be block grants. Then, if the grants aren't working, the federal government can do what's called a mandate. Mandate is states, you must do this. And that's it. Um, it's the federal government telling the states they have to do something. Mandates have two flavors. Some mandates are funded, which means states, you must do this, but we're going to give you the money to do it. And some mandates are unfunded, which means states, you have to do this. Oh, and by the way, you have to come up with the money for it. So a grant, states get the choice whether or not they want to take the money. They can refuse a grant and not meet the requirements. A mandate, states don't get a choice. States have to do it. A funded mandate, at least it comes with money. More often, you're getting unfunded mandates, which means, hey, states, you have to do it, and you got to come up with the money for it. So the Voting Rights Act, which we're going to talk about some tomorrow, came with mandates on states. You have to provide these certain features for people who are registering to vote or when they're voting. So that would be an example of mandates. All right, so if you have any questions, make sure you wrote them down so that we can talk about them tomorrow. You can ask first thing. That's as far as we're going to get today for federalism. We'll finish up federalism stuff tomorrow, and then we will test on Wednesday. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow.